The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of Kalin Vance's penthouse office. Crystal fragments catching the dying Chicago sunlight like fallen stars stood, motionless, at the floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection ghost-like against the sprawling cityscape 40 stories below. The woman who had just stormed out left behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of her final words. "You're nothing but a machine, Kalin. A beautiful, successful machine with no soul." At 38, Kalin Vance commanded Vance Sterling Development like a general commanding armies. His empire of glass and steel stretched across 3 states, each building a testament to his ruthless precision. Tonight's charity gala had been no different from a dozen others. Write a check, smile for cameras, make small talk with Chicago's elite about renovating neighborhoods and creating progress. What he hadn't expected was Victoria Ashworth calling him out in front of half the city's power brokers. "Sir," his assistant Marcus appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "The Iron Row acquisition reports are ready for your review." Kalin turned from the window, his expression settling back into its familiar mask of controlled indifference. The broken glass crunched beneath his Italian leather shoes as he moved to his desk. Status: 17 properties secured. Purchase agreements signed and deposits transferred. Marcus hesitated. "There's one holdout. Name Seraphina Hayes. Owner of the Gilded Needle, a small tailoring shop on Ashland Avenue. She's refused our initial offer of $200,000. Legal sent follow-up notices, but there's been no response." Kalin's fingers drummed once against the polished mahogany. In his world, every problem had a price point. Every person had a breaking point. Double it. Sir, that's significantly above market value for a property that size. Triple it then. Send the offer tomorrow morning with a 48-hour deadline. Kalin pulled up the property files on his computer screen. The Gilded Needle appeared as a small red dot surrounded by blue acquisitions, like a drop of blood on pristine snow. "What do we know about her?" Marcus consulted his tablet. 34 years old, unmarried, no children. Inherited the business from her grandmother 3 years ago. No significant debts, but revenue appears modest. She's been operating at that location for 6 years. Kalin studied the building's exterior photograph. It was narrow, wedged between what would soon be demolition sites. Faded brick, hand-painted sign, flower boxes in the windows. Everything about it screamed outdated, impractical, inefficient. Schedule a site visit for Thursday morning. I want to see this obstacle myself. Thursday arrived, gray and blustery, typical for October in Chicago. Kalin's driver navigated through increasingly. Its narrow streets until corporate towers gave way to neighborhood shops and family restaurants. The scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixed with exhaust fumes and something he couldn't identify. Something warmer. The Gilded Needle sat like a stubborn tooth in a mouth scheduled for extraction. Kalin stepped out of his Mercedes and immediately felt overdressed. His charcoal Armani suit, crafted by the best tailors in Milan, felt like armor. In this place where people walked dogs and carried grocery bags and actually looked each other in the eye, a brass bell chimed as he pushed open the shop door. The sound transported him instantly to his childhood, to his grandmother's house where similar bells announced visitors, and the kettle always seemed to be whistling. He pushed the memory away. The shop was smaller than the photograph suggested, but somehow felt larger than his entire office. Bolts of fabric in every conceivable color lined the walls like a textile rainbow. The air smelled of lavender and old wood and something indefinably feminine. Behind a large cutting table, a woman looked up from her work. Seraphina Hayes was not what he had expected. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, calculated way of the women who usually occupied his attention. Her beauty was organic, unfiltered. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing a face with high cheekbones and eyes the color of amber honey. She wore a simple blue dress that looked handmade, fitted perfectly to her curves without being obvious about it. "Mr. Vance." Her voice was steady, neither welcoming nor hostile. "I wondered when you'd stop hiding behind lawyers and lackeys." Kalin felt his carefully prepared speech dissolve. She knew exactly who he was, and she wasn't impressed. In his world, people either feared him or wanted something from him. Seraphina Hayes seemed to feel neither. "Miss Hayes, I came to discuss your property personally. My home, you mean. She set down her scissors with deliberate care, the place where my grandmother taught me to sew, where she built a business that served this neighborhood for 40 years. Sentiment doesn't increase property values, no, but it increases everything else that matters. She moved around the cutting table, and Kalin caught that scent again. Lavender, but also something earthier. Vanilla maybe, or cinnamon. This neighborhood doesn't need another luxury high-rise, Mr. Vance. It needs places where people can afford to live, to work, to belong. Progress requires sacrifice. Whose sacrifice? She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her eyes. You'll profit millions. While families lose their homes and small businesses disappear, that's not progress. That's just greed wearing an expensive suit. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Kalin built his fortune by understanding people's weaknesses, their breaking points, their price. But standing in this small shop, filled with the evidence of someone's passion and craftsmanship, he felt something crack inside his chest. "Name your price," he said quietly. Seraphina smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Mr. Vance, there isn't enough money in your accounts to buy what this place means to me?" She turned back to her work, dismissing him as easily as she might dismiss a door-to-door salesman. Kalin stood there for a long moment, watching her hands move with practiced precision as she pinned a delicate hem. Those hands created beauty, preserved memories, gave new life to worn things. His hands destroyed and acquired and calculated profit margins. "I'll be back," he said finally. "I'm sure you will." She didn't look up. "The door's behind you." The brass bell chimed again as Kalin stepped back onto the street. His driver waited by the Mercedes, but Kalin found himself walking in the opposite direction. He needed air, needed to think, needed to understand why a simple seamstress had just turned his world upside down with a few honest words. For the first time in 15 years, Kalin Vance had encountered something he couldn't buy, couldn't control, and couldn't ignore. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure he knew the rules anymore. The strategy came to Kalin at 3 in the morning, jarring him awake in his king-sized bed with crystalline clarity. If he couldn't buy Seraphina Hayes, perhaps he could seduce her. The thought should have disgusted him. 3 weeks ago, it would have. But lying there in the darkness of his minimalist bedroom, surrounded by the silence that money could buy, Kalin felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. It's not just the calculating desire to win, but genuine curiosity about the woman who had looked him in the eye and found him wanting. He spent the next morning researching her like he would any acquisition target. Public records revealed little beyond what Marcus had already discovered, but social media painted a richer picture. Seraphina Hayes volunteered at a women's shelter, teaching sewing skills to help them find employment. She organized neighborhood cleanups and holiday toy drives. She was everything Kalin had learned not to trust. His ex-fiancée Alina had been involved in charity work too, right up until she emptied their joint accounts and disappeared with his business partner. That betrayal had taught him that goodness was often just another mask people wore to hide their true intentions. Watching Seraphina through the lens of a private investigator's telephoto camera, Kalin saw no performance, no calculated kindness designed to impress. She simply existed in a world where helping others seemed as natural as breathing. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, when Kalin outlined his plan. They were reviewing architectural renderings for the Iron Row project. But Kalin's attention kept drifting to the red dot on his acquisition map. "Explain. You're getting personally involved? That's never been your style, and it's certainly not your strength." Marcus pulled up financial projections on his tablet. "The construction timeline is already tight. Every day we delay costs us money. Just use eminent domain. The city won't approve it for a functioning business with no code violations. We need her to sell voluntarily, or at least appear to." Kalin traced the outline of the gilded needle with his finger. "Trust me, I've never failed to close a deal." But as he said it, Kalin wondered if he was trying to convince Marcus or himself. The next phase began subtly. Kalin started appearing in Seraphine's neighborhood, but not as the ruthless developer in expensive suits, Instead, he played the role of a man discovering simple pleasures. He bought coffee from the corner cafe, browsed the used bookstore, chatted with shopkeepers about the weather and local events. It took 2 weeks before he worked up the courage to enter the Gilded Needle again. This time he carried a worn leather jacket, genuinely damaged from years of wear. The brass bell announced his arrival with the same cheerful chime, and Seraphina looked up with surprise flickering across her features. "Mr. Vance, back for another lecture about progress?" "Actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with this." He held up the jacket, feeling oddly vulnerable. It had belonged to his father, one of the few possessions Kalin had kept after his parents died in the car accident when he was 12. The lining is torn. Seraphine's expression softened as she examined the jacket. Her fingers traced the worn leather with the same reverence she might show a piece of vintage silk. "This is beautiful work. It's Italian leather, probably 30 years old at least. It was my father's." The words slipped out before Kalin could stop them. He never talked about his parents, never revealed anything personal to anyone. But something about the gentle way Seraphina handled the jacket, the genuine appreciation in her voice, made him want to share that small piece of himself. "I can fix this," she said quietly. "But it'll take a few days. The lining needs to be completely replaced, and I want to match the original stitching pattern exactly. Of course, whatever it costs." Seraphina quoted a price that was less than Kalin typically spent on lunch. As she wrote up a receipt in careful handwriting, he found himself studying her face. She had tiny freckles across her nose that makeup would have hidden. Her nails were short and practical, stained slightly with fabric dye. Everything about her was real, unfiltered, authentic. When had he last met someone authentic? "I'll call you when it's ready," she said, handing him the receipt. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tonight. There's a new restaurant downtown I've been wanting to try." The invitation surprised them both. Seraphine's eyebrows rose, and Kalin felt heat creep up his neck. He was Kalin Vance. He didn't get nervous asking women to dinner. "Why?" she asked simply. The honest question deserved an honest answer, but Kalin found himself caught between truth and strategy. "Because I'd like to get to know you better, away from all the business complications." Seraphina studied his face for a long moment, as if she could read his intentions in his expression. Finally, she nodded. "There's a place called Rosa's, about 6 blocks from here. Real food, reasonable prices, no pretension. If you're genuinely interested in getting to know me, that's where we'll do it." Kalin's first instinct was to suggest somewhere more appropriate for a man of his status. Somewhere with crystal stemware and servers who knew his name and wine lists thicker than most novels. But looking at Seraphine's steady gaze, he realized she was offering him something more valuable than expensive cuisine. She was offering him a glimpse into her world. "Rosa's it is. 7 o'clock. Perfect." Rosa's turned out to be a family-owned Italian place, with checkered tablecloths and wine served in juice glasses. The owner, a woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands, greeted Seraphina with a warm hug and suspicious glances at Kalin's designer clothing. "This is Kalin," Seraphina said simply. "Kalin, meet Rosa Martinelli. She makes the best ossobuco in Chicago. Over plates of perfectly cooked pasta and house red wine that costs less than Kalin's usual bottle of water, something unexpected happened. He forgot to be strategic. Seraphine's genuine interest in his thoughts, her thoughtful questions, and easy laughter made him remember who he'd been before success hardened him into someone he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. She told him about her grandmother, who had fled Italy with nothing but a sewing machine and determination. About learning to create beauty from scraps, to see potential in discarded things. About the satisfaction of helping someone feel confident in their own skin. "What about you?" she asked, as they shared tiramisu that Rosa had insisted was on the house. "What made you want to reshape cities?" Kalin found himself telling her about growing up in foster care after his parents died, about learning that security came from controlling your environment rather than trusting others to care for you. About building something permanent that couldn't be taken away. "But what you're building has no soul," Seraphina said gently. "Beautiful buildings, I'm sure, but no heart." no connection to the people who live and work in them. Heart doesn't pay construction crews or property taxes. No, but it pays in ways you can't calculate on a spreadsheet. She reached across the table and touched his hand just briefly. The contact sent electricity through his entire arm. When was the last time you created something just because it brought joy? Kalin couldn't remember. He'd been so focused on acquisition, on growth, on proving himself worthy of success, that he'd forgotten why he'd wanted to build things in the first place. Walking Seraphina back to her shop under the glow of streetlights, Kalin felt something shifting inside his chest. The carefully constructed walls around his heart were developing hairline cracks, and golden light was seeping through. "Thank you for tonight," he said as they stopped in front of the Gilded Needle. "Thank you for rosas instead of some fancy place where they'd serve foam instead of food." Seraphina smiled, and Kalin felt his breath catch. "Maybe there's hope. For you yet, Mr. Vance?" She disappeared into her shop, leaving Kalin standing alone on the sidewalk, with the uncomfortable realization that his plan was working too well. He was supposed to be seducing Seraphina Hayes to get her property. Instead, she was seducing him back to his own humanity. 3 weeks into what Kalin still told himself was a strategic seduction. The lines between performance and reality had blurred beyond recognition. He found himself looking forward to their evening walks through the neighborhood, to quiet dinners at Rosa's, to the way Seraphine's face lit up when she talked about a particularly challenging alteration she'd completed. More dangerously, he found himself imagining a life where those moments weren't part of a carefully orchestrated plan. "You're different," she said one evening as they sat on the small bench outside her shop, sharing coffee from paper cups and watching the neighborhood settle into dusk. "Not just from when I first met you, but from a few weeks ago. You seem more present, more yourself." Kalin felt his chest tighten. "What makes you think this isn't who I've always been? You mean the man who notices when Mrs. Chen from the bakery looks tired? Or who helped that teenager fix his bike chain yesterday?" Seraphina turned to study his profile. "That man exists, but he's been buried under so many layers of protection, I don't think even you remember him sometimes." She was right, and that terrified him. Kalin had built his identity around control, around emotional distance, around never letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. But Seraphina made him want to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe that. Not everyone was waiting for the perfect moment to betray him. The fear of that vulnerability drove him to Marcus's office the next morning with renewed determination to finish what he'd started. "Status report on the Iron Road timeline," Kalin said without preamble. Marcus looked up from his computer with relief. "Finally? I was beginning to think you'd forgotten we have a business to run." He pulled up the construction schedules. "We're already 6 weeks behind the original timeline. Investors are getting nervous, and the city's breathing down our necks about the housing shortage promises we made." "What about the other properties?" "Demolition is complete on 14 sites. 2 more are scheduled for next week. But we can't break ground on the main construction until we have clear title to the entire block." Marcus leaned back in his chair. How much longer is this seduction going to take? The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. "Hearing?" His plan described so bluntly made Kalin's stomach turn. "I need more time. Time we don't have. The board meeting is scheduled for Friday. They want to see concrete progress, not romantic dinner receipts on your expense account." Marcus pulled up a series of photographs on his monitor. Images of Kalin and Seraphina walking together, sitting at Rosa's, sharing coffee outside her shop. The private investigator had been thorough. "She trusts you now," Marcus continued. "That was the point, wasn't it? Use that trust. Get her too. Sign the papers." Kalin stared at the photographs, seeing himself through Seraphine's eyes. The man in those pictures looked happy, relaxed, genuine. It had been so long since he'd felt those things that he'd almost forgotten they were possible. "Give me until the end of the week." That evening, Kalin arrived at the Gilded Needle with his father's jacket to pick it up, as they'd arranged. But instead of finding Seraphina working quietly at her sewing machine, he discovered her sitting at the cutting table with papers spread before her, her face pale with shock. "Sera, what's wrong?" She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hurt and disbelief. In her hand was a legal document bearing the letterhead of Vance Sterling Development. When were you planning to tell me about this? Her voice was steady, but Kalin could hear the tremor underneath. His blood turned to ice. What is that? An eviction notice. Apparently the building next door sold to your company 3 months ago, and there's some kind of shared foundation issue that makes this property structurally unsound. Seraphine's laugh was bitter. Funny thing is, I had this building inspected 2 years ago when I was considering expansion. The foundation was perfectly sound then. Kalin's mind raced. This wasn't his strategy. This wasn't how he'd planned to handle the situation. Marcus must have initiated legal proceedings without his knowledge. Sera, let me explain. Explain? What? That you've been lying to me for weeks while your lawyers found new ways to force me out? She stood up, the papers crumpling in her fist. That every dinner, every walk, every moment I thought we were connecting was just another business. Strategy. That's not what this is, isn't it? Seraphina moved around the table, and Kalin saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. God, I'm such an idiot. I actually thought you were changing. I thought maybe there was something real between us. There is something real between us. Stop. The word cracked like a whip. Just stop lying. I know who you are, Kalin. I've known from the beginning. You're a man who destroys beautiful things because you've forgotten how to create them. She picked up his father's jacket from behind the counter. The repair worked beautifully, perfectly completed. Instead of handing it to him, she set it on the cutting table between them like a barrier. Your jacket is finished. The lining is replaced, the stitching reinforced. It should last another 30 years if you take care of it. Her voice was professionally neutral, as if she were speaking to a stranger. Consider it my goodbye gift. Seraphina, please, let me explain what really happened. I don't want your explanations. I want you to leave. Kalin picked up the jacket, his hands shaking slightly. The leather felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with memory and loss. What will you do about the building? Fight. The same thing I've been doing since you darkened my doorway. Seraphina crossed her arms, but Kalin could see the vulnerability she was trying to hide. I may not have your resources, but I have something you never learned to value. I have a community that cares about this place. If that's not enough, for the first time since he'd known her, Seraphine's composure cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her voice broke when she answered, Then I guess you win. Again. Kalin left the Gilded Needle feeling like he was walking away. For more than just a building or a business deal, it was walking away from the possibility of becoming someone better than he'd been. Someone worthy of the trust he'd just shattered. Back in his penthouse office, he confronted Marcus with a fury that surprised them both. I told you to wait. And I told you we were running out of time. Marcus didn't look up from his computer. The structural issue is legitimate. By the way, the building next door has foundation problems that could affect her property. It's not fabricated, but the timeline is. Accelerated, yes, but not fabricated. Marcus finally met Kalin's eyes. You're letting your emotions compromise a deal worth $30 million. That's not the man who built this company. Maybe I don't want to be that man anymore. Words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Kalin with the analytical gaze of someone who'd worked with him for 8 years. She's gotten to you. I wondered when this would happen. What do you mean? When you'd meet someone who reminded you what you gave up to become successful. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Kalin looked out at his city, at the towers of glass and steel that bore his name and his vision. He'd built an empire, but standing in his perfect office, surrounded by his perfect things, he felt emptier than he ever had in his life. For the first time since Elena's betrayal, Kalin Vance wondered if there might be something more valuable than winning. The Vance Sterling board meeting convened at 9 sharp on Friday morning in the glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. 12 of the city's most powerful real estate moguls sat around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from impatient to openly hostile. Kalin took his seat at the head of the table, acutely aware that his empire was built on their collective trust in his ability to deliver results. The Iron Row project represented the largest residential development in the city's history, with pre-construction sales already exceeding $200 million. Gentlemen, Board Chairman Richard Ashworth began without preamble. We need to discuss the delays on Iron Row. Our investors are threatening to pull funding if we can't provide a concrete timeline for groundbreaking. Kalin pulled up the architectural renderings on the room's massive display screen. Sleek towers of glass and steel rose like modern monoliths. Each unit designed for maximum profit, with minimal consideration for the community they would replace. The final acquisition is 98% complete, he said with practiced confidence. We expect to close on the remaining property within the next 72 hours. The Hayes property, Ashworth said, consulting his notes. A small tailoring shop refusing to sell? Why haven't you used eminent domain? The business has no code violations and pays taxes. The city won't approve forced acquisition. Kalin clicked to the next slide, showing projected completion dates. We're pursuing alternative solutions. What he didn't tell them was that he'd spent the last 3 days walking the streets around the Gilded Needle, seeing the neighborhood through new eyes. The Korean grandmother who brought her granddaughter's school clothes to Seraphina for alterations. The young father who'd saved for months to buy his wife a dress Seraphina had designed. The teenagers who gathered outside the shop after school, because Seraphina always had cookies and a listening ear. These weren't just obstacles to progress. They were people whose lives would be forever changed by his towers of glass and steel. Alternative solutions? Board member James Crawford leaned forward aggressively. Kalin, you're talking about a $10 million per day delay cost. We need that property cleared and demolished by Monday, or we start facing contract penalties. I understand the financial implications. Do you? Ashworth's voice carried the edge of someone whose patience was exhausted. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've lost your edge. The Kalin Vance I invested with wouldn't be held hostage by some seamstress with sentimental attachments. The words hit harder than they should have, mainly because they echoed Kalin's own fears. Had he gone soft? Had caring about Seraphina compromised his ability to make hard business decisions? Give me until Monday, Kalin said finally. I'll have the property cleared. After the board members filed out, Kalin remained, alone in the conference room, staring at the renderings of his future empire. On paper, Iron Row was everything he'd worked toward. Profitable, prestigious, transformative. So why did it feel like he was looking at a monument to everything wrong with his life? His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Hayes property inspection. Scheduled for Monday at 8 a.m. Structural engineer confirms foundation issues. She'll have to vacate regardless of sale. Kalin closed his eyes, remembering the broken look on Seraphina's face when she'd discovered the eviction notice. He'd caused that pain, even if the structural problems were genuine. His pursuit of her property had set in motion events that would destroy everything she cared about. That evening, he found himself standing outside the Gilded Needle as snow began to fall. The shop glowed warmly against the early winter darkness, and through the windows he could see Seraphina working late, her head bent over a sewing machine with the focused intensity he remembered so well. She looked up as he approached the door, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. The hurt and betrayal he saw there nearly stopped him from entering, but he pushed through the door anyway. The brass bell chimed, but this time the sound felt like a funeral dirge. We're closed, Seraphina said without looking up from her work. I know. I saw your lights on and wanted to check on you. Check on me. She finally raised her head, and Kalin saw exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Is that what you call it when you destroy someone's life? Checking on them? Don't. The foundation issue is real, Sera. I had nothing to do with that, but you had everything to do with accelerating. The timeline. She stood up slowly as if her bones ached. My lawyer says I have 72 hours to vacate the building. 72 hours to pack up 40 years of my family's history. Kalin felt something break inside his chest. Where will you go? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost her. I've been looking at commercial spaces, but everything's either too expensive or too far from my customers. Most of them don't have cars, Kalin. They walk here from the neighborhood. She gestured around the shop, and Kalin saw it as if for the first time. Not just a business, but a sanctuary. A place where people brought their broken things to be made whole again. What if there was another option? What do you mean? Kalin pulled out his phone and showed her architectural plans he'd been working on since leaving the board meeting. What if instead of tearing down this block, we incorporated it into the development, restored the original buildings, created mixed income housing with commercial space on the ground floor? Seraphina stared at the plans, her expression unreadable. This would cost you millions more than your original design. Yes. Your investors would never approve it. Not these investors. No. Then why are you showing me this? Kalin set down his phone and looked directly into her eyes. Because I'm in love with you. Because watching you fight for this place made me remember why I wanted to build things in the first place. Because maybe making something beautiful is more important than making the maximum profit. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they could cross. You're in love with me, Seraphina repeated slowly. Yes. The same man who planned to seduce me to steal my property is now in love with me. Kalin felt heat rise in his cheeks. It started as strategy, but somewhere along the way, it became real. You became real. This became real. Seraphina was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if she could read the truth written there. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you know what the cruelest part is? I fell in love with you too, with the man I thought you were becoming. But I don't know if that man actually exists, or if he's just another character you play when it suits your purposes. He exists. He's standing right here, terrified that he's lost the only thing that ever made him want to be better. Seraphina stepped closer, close enough that Kalin could smell the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that always surrounded her. Close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. Prove it, she said simply. How? Walk away from Iron Row. Build your alternative plan, even if it costs you everything. Show me that love matters more to you than winning. Kalin felt the weight of her challenge settle on his shoulders like a mantle. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, everything that defined him as a man was tied up in this development. Walking away would mean financial ruin, professional suicide, the end of his reputation as someone who always delivered. But looking into Seraphine's eyes, he realized that losing her would be a different kind of ruin, kind he might never recover from. Okay, he said. Okay, what? I'll do it. I'll walk away from Iron Row if that's what it takes to prove. Love you more than I love winning. Seraphina searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was just another strategy. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she stepped into his arms and pressed her face against his chest. This is going to destroy you financially, she whispered. Kalin held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beat against his chest. For the first time in 20 years, he felt completely, perfectly at peace. Then we'll build something new together. Something worth destroying my old life for. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 in the morning. It's called after Kalin's late-night email, outlining his radical, new proposal for Iron Row. The silence in the conference room, deafening as he finished presenting the alternative development plan. Let me see if I understand this correctly, Richard Ashworth said, his voice deadly quiet. You want to scrap a $300 million luxury development to build affordable housing around a seamstress shop? Community-centered mixed development, Kalin corrected, standing firm despite the hostile stares directed at him. Restored historic buildings, mixed-income housing, local business preservation. It's a model that's proven successful in Portland and Seattle. James Crawford slammed his portfolio shut. It's also a model that cuts our profit margins by 60%. Kalin, what the hell has gotten into you? Maybe I've remembered that we're supposed to be building communities, not just bank accounts. The room erupted in angry voices, board members speaking over each other in their rush to express outrage. Through it all, Kalin remained calm, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. Gentlemen, he said finally, his voice cutting through the chaos. I called this meeting to inform you of my decision, not to ask for your approval. Withdrawing from the Iron Row project, the silence that followed was absolute. You can't do that, Ashworth said. We have contracts, investors, city commitments, which I'll fulfill through my personal assets if necessary. Van Sterling will honor every agreement we've made. Kalin gathered his materials with steady hands. What we won't do is destroy a community for profit margins. If you walk away from this project, you walk away from this company, Crawford threatened. Kalin paused at the conference room door, looking back at the men who had helped him build his empire. Then I guess I'm walking away from this company. The legal battles that followed were swift and brutal. By the end of the week, Kalin had been voted out as CEO of Vance Sterling. His personal assets frozen in litigation, his professional reputation in ruins. The financial press had a field day with headlines about the real estate mogul who lost his mind over a seamstress, but walking into the Gilded Needle that Friday evening, watching Seraphine's face light up when she saw him, Kalin felt richer than he ever had in his glass tower. You actually did it, she said, setting down her sewing to come to him. You walked away from everything, not everything. He pulled her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. I walked toward everything that matters. They spent that weekend planning their future, not the grand strategic planning Kalin was used to, but the intimate planning of two people building a life together. Seraphina would keep the Gilded Needle, and Kalin would use his remaining resources to start a new kind of development company, one focused on community preservation and sustainable growth. It won't be easy, Seraphina warned, as they sat in her small apartment above the shop, sharing takeout Chinese food and dreams. Starting over at 40 isn't exactly ideal. I've never been afraid of hard work. I've only been afraid of caring too much. Kalin traced patterns on her palm with his finger. You taught me that caring too much is the only way to build something that lasts. 6 months later, Kalin stood in the same spot where the Gilded Needle had fought for survival. But the neighborhood around it had been transformed. The Iron Row community development project was taking shape exactly as he'd envisioned. Historic buildings restored to their original beauty, new affordable housing that complemented rather than overwhelmed the existing architecture, and at the heart of it, all the Gilded Needle. Thriving as the community's cultural center, the project had attracted investors who valued impact over pure profit, architects who specialized in sustainable development, and residents who understood that luxury wasn't about granite countertops, but about belonging somewhere that felt like home. The city planning committee approved the expansion proposal, Seraphina said, joining him on the sidewalk outside her shop. She was wearing the ring he'd given her the month before, a simple band of gold that had belonged to his grandmother. We can break ground on the community center next month.
Good.
The neighborhood kids need somewhere safe to go after school. Kalin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Mrs. Chen wants to teach cooking. Classes there, and I'll teach sewing workshops. Full circle. She leaned back against his chest, both of them watching the sunset paint their rebuilt neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. Do you ever miss it? The old life? The power? The money? Kalin considered the question seriously. His bank account was a fraction of what it had been. His new company operated on margins that would have horrified his former self. He drove a used truck instead of a luxury sedan, and he'd traded his penthouse for a small apartment 2 blocks from the Gilded Needle. I miss the certainty sometimes, he admitted. The feeling that I could control everything, that I was invulnerable. But I don't miss being alone. You're not alone anymore. No, I'm not. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors return home from work. Children playing in the small park they'd incorporated into the development, elderly residents sitting on benches and sharing stories. This was what Kalin had been unconsciously searching for his entire adult life without knowing it. Not just success, but significance. Not just profit, but purpose. There's something I need to tell you, Seraphina said, turning in his arms to face him. What, I'm pregnant? The words hit Kalin like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stopping his heart for a moment before kick-starting it into overdrive. He searched her face, seeing joy and nervousness and hope all mingled together. Pregnant, he repeated. About 2 months, I found out yesterday. Her voice wavered slightly. I know we haven't talked about children. With everything that's been happening with the business and the development, Kalin silenced her with a kiss that tasted like forever. When they broke apart, both of them were crying. I love you, he whispered against her forehead. I love you, and I love this baby, and I love the life we're building together. Even though it's going to be complicated and messy, and nothing like the controlled existence you're used to, especially because of that." 9 months later, Kalin held his daughter for the first time in the same hospital where he'd been born. Alina Rose Vance came into the world at dawn, her tiny fist wrapped around her father's finger with a grip that seemed to anchor him to earth. "She's perfect," Seraphina whispered from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "She's ours," Kalin replied. The word held more meaning than any contract he'd ever signed or building he'd ever erected. Looking down at his daughter's face, Kalin saw the future stretching out before them, not the controlled, strategic future he'd once planned, but something richer and more unpredictable. Alina would grow up in the community they'd built together, surrounded by people who knew her name and cared about her dreams. She would learn to value creativity over profit, connection over control, love over winning. She would learn that some things couldn't be bought or conquered or strategically acquired. They could only be nurtured, protected, and cherished. 5 years after that first meeting in the Gilded Needle, Kalin stood in the same shop, now expanded to include a community workshop space and childcare area. Alina played quietly in the corner with blocks, while Seraphina worked on a wedding dress for a neighborhood bride. The brass bell chimed. A young businessman entered, looking around with the same calculating expression Kalin had once worn. He was probably in his 30s, expensive suit, confident bearing, smartphone already in hand to take photos of the property for evaluation. "Can I help you?" Seraphina asked politely. "I'm looking for the owner. I represent Morrison Development, and we're interested in purchasing this building for a new mixed-use project." Kalin stepped forward, recognizing himself from years ago in this young man's ambition and certainty. "I'm her husband and business partner. What exactly are you proposing?" The businessman launched into a presentation about profit margins and development potential, about the inefficient use of prime real estate and the financial opportunities of modernization. Kalin listened with the patience of someone who had once spoken the same language. "You're offering fair market value," Kalin said, when the presentation ended. "But I think you're missing something important." "What's that?" "This isn't just a building. It's a home. It's a community hub. It's a place where people bring broken things to be made whole again." Kalin looked around the shop, seeing it as he had that first day, but now understanding its true value. Some things are worth more than money can measure. The businessman looked confused, clearly not understanding how anyone could turn down such a lucrative opportunity. He left his card and promised to call with an improved offer, never realizing he was speaking to someone who had already found the only treasure that mattered. That evening, dead, as they tucked Alina into bed and read her favorite story about a princess who saved the kingdom with kindness instead of swords. Kalin reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a man who measured worth in dollars and square footage, who believed that winning was the only thing that mattered. Through love and loss and the courage to change, he had discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be acquired or conquered. They could only be earned through the slow, patient work of becoming someone worthy of them. As Seraphina fell asleep beside him, her hand resting on his chest above his heart, Kalin smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose love over profit, community over control. He had learned that true success wasn't about building the tallest towers or making the most money. It was about creating something that would last long after you were gone. Something that made the world a little more beautiful, a little more connected, a little more human. In the end, the cold-hearted CEO had discovered that the warmest hearts were the strongest of all. The end asterisk. Like this video, if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.